Hello, I'm Doc Gilberg, cutman for Professional Combat Sports. I get questions on Facebook from time to time asking me how I control cuts and bleeding at the ringside. Well, let's be real. First of all, there's no magic. There's no right way, there's no wrong way. Lots of people have their own little particular techniques, and the bottom line is this. If you control the bleeding, if the fight continues, if there's no fight stoppage due to bleeding, then you're successful. That's the bottom line. But I will share with you right now some of the ways and techniques that I work, and that's been fairly successful for me over the years. First and foremost, before a fight, there are certain considerations that you can offer your athlete regarding dietary restrictions or modifications. There are certain foods that will promote blood clotting, like leafy green vegetables, and there are also certain foods to avoid, foods that interfere with the platelet portion of blood clotting. And those foods are like fish oils, omega-3. You should stay away from that, as well as any product that contains aspirin. You should encourage the intake of natural sources of vitamin C. Following that for about a week or so before a fight may very well improve the blood clotting capabilities if your fighter should develop or experience a cut. Keep in mind that there are certain facial characteristics on every fighter that are individual. Facial landmarks of your athlete. Some people have very prominent cheekbones, and keep in mind that there are blood vessels very close to the surface in this region, below the eye and above the eye, all in the region of the bony orbit or the socket that the eye sits in. That particular region is particularly susceptible to being cut from a glancing blow during combat sports. In a moment, I'm going to show you a diagram that displays some of those blood vessels. But keep in mind that these regions are particularly susceptible to a bleeding injury, and a bleed above the eye can very easily drip into the eye, causing difficulty seeing and a fight stoppage if not adequately controlled. Looking at this diagram of the facial blood vessels, you can see the eye, and then immediately below it, to the side and above it, there's an elaborate network of blood vessels that supply this region. Keep in mind that there are three basic types of blood vessels that can bleed. There's capillary bleeding, which is very minor and just tends to ooze. But beyond that, there is a potential for a vein to bleed, which has a slow, steady flow of blood and is usually easy to control. However, if the cut is deeper, you might actually sever a small artery, which produces a more vigorous blood flow, which will be difficult to control and would be very prone to rebleeding in the following round. Something to keep in mind as you approach any bleed is the fact that cold is a natural constrictor of blood vessels. If you have a blood vessel that's open and bleeding freely, if it's exposed to cold, it will naturally constrict. The constriction of that blood vessel may by itself just stop the bleeding. Anytime you've reached the point of controlling the bleed, you always want to finish by applying a little plug of iced cold Vaseline. Personally, I keep my Vaseline in a refrigerator overnight until the time of fight, and then I keep the Vaseline in my ice bucket. And during the rounds, I'll take a fresh plug of Vaseline, apply it to my glove, and then as needed, I will apply it to the cut. For purposes of demonstration, let's assume that Leaf has a cut over the right eye in the region of the eyebrow. If we were to take gauze and just apply direct pressure and squeeze for the duration of the in-between rounds, and at the whistle, apply some Vaseline, a plug of ice-cold Vaseline, that should control the bleeding in a majority of times. If the event occurs where that cut rebleeds, then the thought to become more aggressive in the use of some of the medications that are sanctioned by the various boxing commissions would come into play. And I would like to discuss some of those right now. 3 medications are typically permitted in most combat sport jurisdictions and athletic commissions, both nationally and actually internationally as well. One of them is adrenaline in the concentration of 1 to 1,000. Another one is Avatine, and a third one is thromboplastin. I work regularly with adrenaline, 1 to 1,000, and Avatine. Thromboplastin is extraordinarily expensive and rarely used except in those occasions where bleeding is just not going to be an option for you. While there are no right or wrong ways to apply the adrenaline, the method that I employ, I'm very comfortable with and has been successful. I'm going to show that to you right now. It requires an unexpired, which means current dated, container of adrenaline, which is generally a vial, has a safety cap which you'll flip off, and then we're going to draw it out using a syringe with a needle. Syringe with a needle. Safely apply. Pull the cap off. Draw back on the plunger. Insert the needle into the bottle. Push the air in and extract the medication out. Having done that, I'm going to put it down for a moment and take a regular Ziploc bag or plastic bag and put my cotton tip gauze inside, and then I'm going to soak them with the adrenaline right in the bag. So these cotton tip swabs are going to be saturated with adrenaline. After you do that, there is a safety cap on the needle which you will engage for your own protection. At this point, we have our swabs soaking in adrenaline, and I'm going to carefully just round this up a little bit and put that in a second bag like this. And in the second bag, I am now going to fill with ice. So we have ice in a separate compartment from the adrenaline-soaked swabs. I am then going to keep that in my pocket where, if needed, I can just pull it out for use. The round is ended, Lee returns to the corner, and the cut over the right eye that we tried to control with direct pressure last round is now rebleeding. So we're going to become much more aggressive. We're going to take an adrenaline-soaked swab in a piece of gauze and apply it with pressure directly into the cut. The purpose of this extra gauze is to prevent any of the adrenaline from dripping into the eye. We're going to hold this with firm pressure, and at the same time, freehand can be used to apply grease or a second swab to apply to a second cut. At the conclusion of the in-between round period, the whistle blows. We're going to remove the swab, apply a plug of ice-cold Vaseline to the cut, and get out of the way. In the unlikely event that a wound that has been treated with adrenaline rebleeds, the next step that I would move towards would be to apply Avatine. Avatine also, like adrenaline, has an expiration date, so you want to make sure that it's current. Avatine comes in 3 forms. One is a powder, which would be very difficult to work with ringside. One is a small little piece of gauze, which you could apply. While the other, which is what I have here, is almost like a little sponge. You can remove it and then just apply it to the wound with direct pressure. Once again, holding it to the very end of the between round period. The whistle blows, remove it, apply a cold plug of Vaseline, and step out. During the following round, if you notice that Leith has sustained a rebleed at the bell when he returns to the corner, be prepared to immediately apply the Avitine to the wound. Use direct pressure as firmly as possible, and when the whistle blows, replace the Avitine with adrenaline, followed quickly by a plug of cold Vaseline, and he should be good. If both the adrenaline and Avitine have failed to control your bleeding, and you are equipped to use the thromboplastin comes as a liquid and a solid, which get mixed and activated for use. The method that I've heard is most effective is instead of using the supplied liquid to add to the solid and create the solution, some people actually use adrenaline in the same quantity as the supplied liquid and add that to the solid portion of the thromboplastin. That could then be applied to the cotton swabs in a plastic bag the same way that you would normally keep the adrenaline, that is on ice and cold, ready for use. One of the more challenging situations is where you actually have bleeding from a site that you cannot visualize, such as in a nosebleed. The way that I address that is I take a cotton swab that has been pre-soaked with adrenaline and will insert it into the nostril that's bleeding and apply direct pressure. You can actually do this both nostrils if you had blood coming from both. You're gonna hold it there for as long as possible. At the same time, you can still use your other hand to apply grease when necessary, or another adrenaline-soaked swab to address another cut. Just a quick word about the difference in the mechanism of action of adrenaline and Avitine. Adrenaline works as a very potent constrictor of blood vessels. When it's applied to a cut, any bleeding vessel may squeeze down or constrict on itself, stopping the flow of blood. Avitine works differently. Avitine actually promotes the formation of a clot to stop the bleeding. In conclusion, let me just state that I believe it's very important to address every cut, regardless of how minor it appears, as aggressively as possible. My own preference is to use adrenaline on every single cut that I treat, regardless of how small. It's quite possible that a small cut in one round can extend with repeated blows into a fight-stopping major cut in a later round, and that's something that should be avoided at all costs. Should you have any further questions or want to communicate with me, I can be reached at NYCutman on Facebook.